Solvete omnes, nomen mihi magisteriets est, et hodie dicemus perfect passive Latin verbs. So, when we're talking about passive Latin verbs, there's a couple things we need to know. First and foremost, the four principal parts that you've already been given. So, for example, laudo, laudare, laudavi, laudatum. What we're talking about here, for the first time, really, is that fourth principal part. So, for example, laudatum. For sum esse fui futurum, it's futurum. For moneo, monere, monui, monitum, it's monitum. Every single one of these forms will end with an Normally it will end with a T before it, but sometimes it's an S. Sometimes you'll see some R's in there, like with futurum. But normally, for the majority of Latin verbs, it's going to end with a tum. This is your fourth principal part, and it's called the perfect passive participle. Now, a participle, and this is true in English as well as in Latin, and really any language, a participle is an adjective based off of a verb. So take, for example, the verb to cry in English. If we want to describe someone crying, we don't have to say every single time that the child is crying and he is over there. We can say something much simpler, like the crying child is over there. And that makes language itself much quicker, because we don't always want to give an action the status of being a full verb, because then we make it seem like it's more important than it really is. In the sentence, the crying child is over there, the real emphasis is where the child is, not necessarily what the child is doing. So, laudatum, we know comes from laudo, laudare, which means to praise. In laudatum, literally, and you'll very rarely ever translate this literally, means having been praised. And laudatum, with a um at the end, is referring to a thing. If we want to talk about a masculine noun or simply a guy, we can say laudatus, and it declines. Laudatus, laudati, laudato, laudatum, laudato, laudati, laudatorum, laudatis, laudatos, laudatis. Just like you would see with any other kind of adjective. So don't freak out about the fact that this is a verb seemingly with case. It's not. It's an adjective simply using an action as the stem. In the same way that we could say, the good boy is running, we could say the boy is good and he's running. It's a very similar kind of thing. So really, it's just an adjective with a verbal stem. With laudatus, laudata, laudatum in hand, having been praised, to make something a perfect passive in Latin, all we have to do is add a form of sum. Now, with the forms of sum es est, sumus estis sunt, is present. Erro, erris, erre, errimus, erritis, errunt is future, and erram, erras, errat, erramus, erratis, errant is imperfect. You don't have to worry about the perfect forms here. None of the fui, fuisti, any of that. You don't have to worry about it. To make the perfect passive tense, just perfect passive, you use the present form of sum. And really this makes sense because sometimes we'll refer to the perfect tense as the present perfect tense. So present goes with the perfect tense. To make it pluperfect, so if I wanted to say I had been praised, I would say laudatus, because clearly I'm a guy, and erram, I had been praised. Now if I want to make it future, I would say laudatus erro, I will have been praised. And really, in a lot of ways, Latin perfect passive is a lot easier to construct and a lot easier to understand, and that's partially why the Romans didn't have such an aversion to the passive voice, especially with a passive construction this complex, like you'd have in English. We don't use it very much, specifically because it is really wordy. Latin takes the 5 words of English, I shall have been praised, and turns them into 2, laudatus erro. Now, I told you earlier that the participle declines, but here's the really nice thing. If you think back to when we learned about the forms of sum, you know that we've got a thing called predicate nominative. That is to say, if I want to say the boy is good, I don't change the word good into the accusative, I change it into the nominative. Because sum isn't really expressing an action, it's expressing a relationship between two things, two ideas. Puer, the boy, is one idea, and bonus, good, is the other. And I wanted to say these two things are the same. So, we're going to be still dealing with this idea of predicate nominative, because the participle will agree in case, number, and gender with the thing being modified. And since we're talking about passive voice and the subject receiving the action, it will always be the subject, which we know is nominative case. So as you can see, this does make a basic kind of sense. The subject receives the action and the participle has to agree in case, in number, and in gender with the thing we're talking about. So if I were to conjugate the perfect passive voice, I would say laudatus, laudata, laudatum, sum, and I'll say laudatus from here on out, but you can presume I'm meaning laudatus, laudata, laudatum. Laudatus sum, laudatus est, laudati, laudatai, laudata, sumus, laudati, estis, laudati, sunt. As you can tell, when we got to the plural, we had to change the ending because we're changing from singular over to plural. So at this point, there's a couple questions that'll pop up on the screen, and I want you to try and answer these as best as you can. We will talk together tomorrow about this. I want to make one more comment about how we look at perfect passives. In English, you've been used to since you were a little kid. In fact, when you were a baby, your brain started understanding this pretty quickly. We use verbal phrases a lot in English. We don't condense things like it does in Latin. And so you've been really used to, in English of course, seeing phrases like I have been praised, but you're not really used to seeing that in Latin. In fact, up to this point, except for the rare thing like possum laudare or debeo laudare, I can praise or I ought to praise, you haven't actually seen any kind of verbal phrase working quite like this. So the big trick is looking at the sentence and realizing that this participle and this form of sum go together. And it's not always necessarily right next to each other, because since it is two words, you can branch things out a bit. Normally, this will not happen too much. Normally, these words will stick fairly close together, but you will see it occasionally with some word in between it. So just remember, word order is flexible, but these two things do go together in a fundamental way. If you have a pretty comfortable understanding of this, what I want you to do is to go on and listen to the video about interrogative words, which hopefully will be a little bit shorter than this. This is the bulk of the material for this particular chapter. When we talk about interrogative words, it will be fairly short and sweet. It's not mentioned a whole lot in the book, but I will try to break it down a little bit more so that way it is a little easier to understand what Wheelock's trying to do with this very brief explanation. Until then, valete discipuli et discipulae, et vos dehinc videbo. I'll see you later.